Good evening. Welcome to the New England Hemophilia Association's webinar tonight called Mental Health, Let's Talk About It Too. My name is Rich Vazillo and I'm NEHA's Executive Director. I'll be the moderator for tonight's webinar. During last year's Fall Fest, Debbie Della Riva of Mental Health Matters Too gave a keynote presentation. We are fortunate that Debbie is offering this important presentation as a webinar tonight to discuss mental health issues in the bleeding disorder community, to help you recognize when someone is struggling, and to offer resources on where to turn for help. A little bit about our friend Debbie. Debbie received a master's degree in counseling psychology from the University of Houston and became a licensed professional counselor. Her work experiences have included serving as a stress management therapist in a psychiatric hospital, managing mental health resource department, and was an executive director of an affiliate of Mental Health America. When Debbie's son was born with severe hemophilia in 1994, she and her family quickly became involved with the bleeding disorder community on a local and national level. Debbie is a former executive director of the Lone Star chapter of the National Hemophilia Foundation, the past co-chair of the National Hemophilia Foundation's annual meeting, and a recipient of the Ricky Ray Award for her advocacy efforts. In addition to founding Mental Health Matters Too, Debbie is a certified mental health first aid instructor and provides training to hemophilia treatment centers and chapters across the country. Before I turn it over to Debbie, I would just like to go over a few housekeeping webinar points and helpful hints. So tonight's webinar will last for approximately 1 hour. We welcome your participation and questions. You should have a GoToWebinar control panel either on the right or left-hand side of your screen. Your audio will be muted by the system for the duration of the webinar. However, if you have a question at any point during the webinar, we encourage you to use the question box in the chat feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your control panel. So again, in your GoToWebinar control panel, there's a question box. You can type your question in there, and at the end of the webinar, I will read the question out loud to Debbie. With that said, Debbie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rich. I just want to tell you thank you so much for inviting me to Fall Fest. I've heard so many great things about that meeting and definitely was not disappointed. And I'm thrilled to be able to facilitate this webinar. Many times when I go around the country in speaking, I'm just so aware of, I'm so gracious about the people that are there, but I'm so aware that there's so many people that aren't able to get to these amazing conferences. So you're doing a great thing for the community. Gosh, let me go ahead and just get you started and tell you a little bit about myself. You'll probably see a pic there of my family. That's my son, Jorge. I call him the reason for the season, the one with severe hemophilia. There's my husband, Jorge, who just rolled off the board as chair of NHF. And there's my beautiful daughter, Christina, who is affected because everyone in the family is an affected member, but she's not carrying the gene for hemophilia. She's been a remarkable time in NHF's NYLI program. Strongly recommend that. This next statement is going to date me a little bit because when my son was born, it was still an option to treat hemophilia severe A with Profir or not. In fact, he was one of the 67 young kids, toddlers, that were part of a joint outcome study, where, of course, we decided that prophylaxis was the way to go, and we're able to get the energy going with our health insurance companies, get them on board. You know, my son's story probably similar to yours. Your children with bleeding disorders, led an active, relatively normal life by playing tennis and the high school band and golf, and also had those times where things were not so great, bleeds that kept him out of activities, and bleeding episodes that were painful. The most significant of which was when he developed epiglottitis, where basically he landed in the ICU because not only the swelling was happening, but also his throat was closing. So he's been through a lot of things, and now he's in Dallas pursuing a master's degree in data analytics. Isn't that an interesting two sets of statements? It's just how we roll in the bleeding disorder community. You can be having a life-threatening bleed at one point and be at the top of your game and living your best life at another one. It's interesting, as Rich said, I was the executive director of LungStar chapter. I've been in this community for over 25 years, but it seems like I've kept this kind of distinction between the fact that I'm, a professional and a therapist and in our community. But at some point in time, I began to hone in to see that this community is at a place where it wants to talk about bleeding disorders and their mental health and how they interact with one another. A lot of people probably know about this amazing human, Chris Bombardier, who summited the highest elevations of mountains in 7 different continents, and at the same time has a phobia of needles, and went through a really dark period where he was resenting having hemophilia. He actually said the word, "I hated having hemophilia," because it ended his baseball career at that time for him. So, and you can see he's speaking about this a couple of years ago in Lord Kelly's Pen magazine. This is Antonio Morgado. Maybe not a lot of people know who he is. I had the pleasure of meeting him at a Hope conference. Let's just say that Antonio didn't have the best of childhood, and he said he struggled with not feeling good enough. And how he dealt with his hemophilia is that he made sure he did the most dangerous thing, that he would accept all the challenges because he needed to show that he was better, because at the heart he was feeling less than. Antonio had a problem with substance abuse, turned his life completely around. You can read here that he had something called Hemogamer, where basically it's a way for people with bleeding disorders to be on the games and talk to one another about real life. I think most people know who that young man is. I say he's young because I'm 56. That's Patrick Lynch. He has decided, he has taken it upon himself to be at the vulnerable state and talk openly about his depression and anxiety. I don't think Patrick ever wanted to be the poster child of what it's like emotionally to struggle with hemophilia and depression, but he's chosen to do so, and I really owe a lot to him because he's normalizing the conversation. And then you have Barry Hardy. For those of you who have heard me present in the past, it is true. When I was at Barry Hardy's funeral, that is when I developed this sense of urgency and a call to action to increase awareness of the emotional issues in our community. Because Barry lost his battle to depression, and I was thinking to myself, if someone like Barry, so well regarded, well respected, if he's struggling with this, there's got to be countless of others. So that's why I got involved and got going. So it didn't take long to figure this out, and a lot of what I'm going to say is so obvious, but I came up with the top 3 reasons why we really need to become more vigilant about mental health issues in our community. Here's the first one. Put aside our bleeding disorders. Mental health conditions are common. Most people know this stat, and it's very exciting that people know this, not that it's happening. But 1 in 5 people in the U.S. are living with a mental health condition at any time. That's 20% of 328 million people. And that kind of gives you an idea. I'm not saying the number, I'm not great at math, but I want to let you know that it's more than we think. We also know, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, that half of all mental health conditions began and come to fruition by the time that somebody is 14, and 3/4 by the time that they're 25. I wanted everyone to know about this stat because it tells us that the more we can become aware of signs and symptoms, the earlier we can catch this, the more likely we can prevent mental illness and issues from wreaking so much havoc in our lives. This surprises a lot of people, and I feel like the number is low, but the time that there's an onset or that you're wrapped up in mental illness in your own life to the time you seek treatment, on average, is about 10 years. It's much, much higher for depression and a little bit lower for anxiety. And it's just speaks to the fact that this schism we have between physical illness and mental illness, because between you and me, I don't think any of us would let a bleed go on for 10 years before we sought attention for it. And only 40% of people in any given year are seeking treatment. So when I ask the question to the audience, of course, the answer always has to do with stigma. And it's true. Stigma is probably one of the biggest obstacles to care, even before cost, even before, traveling to it. It's, there's still a huge degree of shame, feeling defective, feeling that something's wrong with us, that we're not willing to admit to it. So I'm hoping by going around the country and talking about this, we're going to see having depression is just like missing a protein that's involved with clotting. And no shame for it. Before I start this next slide, we are very outnumbered in terms of the number of us and the resources we have within our community. But having said that, I want to let you know that there are some fabulous treatment centers with full-fledged psychological services available within the HTC. That would be where I would encourage my son to go to first to talk about what was really going on. But then we have to be real, too. Back in the 70s, when they were developing our comprehensive care models, always have a doctor and a nurse and a physical therapist and a social worker. We weren't aware of how many we were. And now we're dealing with all kinds of disease states within bleeding disorder. On top of that, the 145 social workers we have, some of them are split between oncology and hematology. So there's the number. There's 145 and 7 psychologists to address the emotional needs of all of us with hemophilia and von Willebrand's and rare bleeding disorders, thrombophilia, and us, the families. So as I dove more into this, what became really pressing to me is how much, just by the sheer fact that we live with a bleeding disorder, we have kind of a vulnerable state, a medical condition, we share the risk factors associated with depression. But before I say this, I want to be very clear, very careful too, to let you know there's plenty of us who are thriving. They're living their best life. They might be having some difficult periods, but having a bleeding disorder doesn't mean you're going to be depressed or anxious. I now do that as a caveat because once I was doing the slide and a lady just started bawling, and how can I stop my son from having depression? So I thought I'd better tone it down a bit, but we've got to know about the risk factors. Ongoing stressors and anxiety. I can almost hear you laughing on the other side of the line. That's a no-brainer. Yes, it's the financial stress, the stress on relationships, the anticipatory anxiety about having bleeds, being able to have health insurance. I can go on and on. Just to let you know that is a risk factor for developing these conditions. History of a traumatic event. I'd like to pause by taking a moment to acknowledge what we went through as a community, the horrific event that we were in because of the medication we thought were prolonging our lives, were contaminating us with Hep C and HIV. So I want to really honor those who have lost family members, those who understandably are still struggling with the emotional ramifications of this. And it is a traumatic event, and yes, it can increase the probability that you struggle down the road, understandably. But also for people who are new in the community or who are on these products where you're not bleeding any longer or what have you, it's wonderful that we're in a very optimistic time. And at the same time, we all need to acknowledge that we were affected by that traumatic event. I know for me personally, there's a degree of unrest at all times because I know what happened in the past. So we just need to be aware of traumatic events and how they can create problems. Of course, the family history of mental health conditions. Substance abuse, it's a huge risk indicator to develop depression and anxiety. And I'm aware as a community we deal also very much so with short-term and chronic pain, and sometimes we use medications to self-medicate. Um, I'm looking, I'm looking not forward to hearing about it. I'm wanting to find out about how opioid use and abuse and death by opioid abuse is affecting our community. I'm sure a lot of you are wondering the same thing. Emotional sensitivity. I'd like to take a minute to explain this. An emotionally sensitive person is someone that they could probably wear a T-shirt that says all the feels. It's just that person that is really impacted by words or behavior of others, or other people can just kind of roll it off and move along. And an emotionally sensitive people, they feel things on a deeper level. Also, on top of that, they feel for others more than other people do. I know a lot of adult men in our community that are affected almost on a daily basis because of watching, their blood brother struggle with during difficult times. Chemical imbalance, yes, emotional illness is real, and it's a result of all kinds of physical states. Maybe you don't make enough serotonin. Maybe you make too much cortisol when things become very stressful in your life. Chemical imbalance has a great deal to do with it. But this is the one that keeps me up at night, and this is the one that keeps me, gives me the energy to go around and to talk about this. And illness is life-threatening, chronic, and especially associated with pain. That is it's a pretty significant risk factor. Let me switch for just a moment. All of this is going to seem very apparent, but I'd like to break it down a little bit. We know that mental health affects our physical being, and we know that how we're feeling physically affects how we feel. But if I could just give some examples of this. A telltale sign of depression is lack of energy or motivation. I think all the time about how that leads to problems with treatment adherence, especially if you're feeling hopeless or helpless. And of course, we know that the more we exercise, the stronger our joints get. Well, the lack of energy definitely does damage on that part of it. Agitation. Agitation is a telltale sign of gentlemen that are struggling with depression or anxiety. And you can imagine it negatively affects relationships. And it can affect your relationship with your doctor and your treatment team. And that has implications. Agitation also can lead to isolation and loneliness. Isolation can be caused by feeling different or having a low self-esteem because feeling not good enough. Well, the scientists have been able to put the quantitative figures on this. Loneliness, they say, has the same physical effect of smoking 15 cigarettes per day in terms of how it affects your overall health. The mental health sign of risky behavior, like not caring enough for yourself. Many times we see this in our depressed youth and young adults, and we know that can lead to injuries and substance abuse. This slide about how your physical health affects your mental health is way too complicated than it needs to be, but I wanted to home in on the physical symptom of pain and how that affects how you feel about life in general. If anyone's ever experienced chronic pain, you know it increases your chance of feeling angry, maybe resentful, having fear that it's not going to be able to be controlled. And that leads to many times depression or feeling like you don't have the ability to get out of the situation. There's been a couple of studies that talk about when you're feeling depressed, it actually increases your perception of pain as well. So that's a kind of a double whammy when you already have pain. And then, of course, on the physical side, we know any of us who's had an injury, when we're in pain, we avoid the activity. The more you avoid the activity, the less developed your body is, and the less you're able to do. So that's just a very common sense way of looking at how pain can really affect us in both realms, our head and our body. I'm going to do one slide on research associated with having a bleeding disorder and the impact of mental health. But I want to pause here for a moment. That I'm going to show you one slide, but I want to acknowledge that this is not enough. Meaning that we are so different in this community. You have somebody that's struggling to get out of bed while someone's climbing up all the top of the mountains. We have those with severe hemophilia all the way to mild and above Willebrand, inhibitors and siblings. And so I'm happy to say that that information is coming, and also want to let you know how you can obtain that information. But I've put it upon myself to make sure I add every piece of psychosocial research I can find on bleeding disorders on my website, which is called Mental Health Matters 2, TOO. That's going to be coming out in the spring. One thing you can do right now, though, if you want to play a big part in making sure we understand the data about how mental health is affecting us, you can go to NHF's BDC, My Bleeding Disorder Community. And they're compiling information on us all over the nation. And through this registry, we're going to be able to understand how we're really doing and how emotions and physicalness are affecting us. So there's a plug for NHF. But I did want to spend time on this slide because it's important. It came out of the Arizona Treatment Center in 2012 and was published in Hemophilia Journal. It's a very small study, 41 men, age 18 to 80, and they used measurements to measure depressive symptoms. And what you're seeing in front of you is 37% of them met criteria for depression, and over half of them said that their symptoms were moderate to severe. Now, if you look in the next slide, the next sentence, well, we know the rate of depression in the general population is about 5.3, which is about 6 times as high. Now, mind you, too, this is a different era. These gentlemen are actively also having comorbidities of Hep C, chronic pain, and HIV. But at the same time, I've seen other studies that talk about the fact that having a chronic condition can sometimes increase the chance of developing depression by 6 times. 76% of those said, yes, it's affecting my daily functioning. But I think one of the other things important about this study is that we're going to figure out, okay, so what's the common denominator between those gentlemen that have depression and those that don't? And it comes down seriously to support systems and employment. If you have a perceived lack of social support, the study indicates you're 5 times more likely to have depressive symptoms. And lack of employment has a lot to do with lack of meaning or lack of purpose. And like I said, you'll be seeing a whole lot more information on studies like that. This next slide is where I stop in a presentation if I was doing it in front of people and ask people to spend about 5 minutes defining mental illness. Like if you walk out of the door in a conference and explain it to a friend that you see in the hall, what is mental illness? How would you describe it? Well, here's the first part of it. It's diagnosable. And I make a big part of saying it is a condition that's diagnosable. And just like a bleeding disorder, there's a cluster of symptoms and signs. Same thing. I'm sure a lot of people know, or maybe you don't, but there's an entire manual. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's in its 5th edition. DSM-5 is what it's called. And within that manual, they have agreed upon criteria for labeling somebody, for diagnosing someone as having a mental health condition. So there's agreement upon these things. With diagnosis is treatment, and with treatment is hope. So a mental health condition is diagnosable, and it involves these signs and symptoms having to do with the way you think and you feel and you behave and the way that your body feels. So it's a diagnosable condition. It involves the way that you think and feel and act and feel physically. And the word should be and there, and it is affecting your life in these 3 different areas. Your ability to work or to be a student, just jumping into your life. Do what you need to do for daily living. And it affects your ability to having satisfying relationships or not. So that's the very long way of describing what mental health condition are. I see this is, you can see on the right hand side, that's where I got the idea of the puzzles to represent my company, because that is who we are as a person. We are a conglomeration of all the pieces. And it's also a great way to explain mental illness. Before I go on to talk about the signs and symptoms of depression, I went ahead and pulled out the DSM-5. And so it's a little lengthy, but I think it's really important to know about what are the symptoms of depression and what are not the symptoms. So the way they describe it, you've got to meet, the way you meet the criteria of having diagnosis of depression is that you would need to be experiencing 5 or more of these symptoms during the same 2-week period, and at least one of the symptoms has to include a depressed mood or loss of interest. So again, if you'd be checking off one of these 5. Depressed mood most of the day, marked lack of interest in things that used to bring you pleasure or activities in general, significant weight loss when not dieting, or weight gain, or decrease or increase in your appetite, a slowing down of your thoughts, and a reduction of physical movement. Number 5 is fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Number 6, feelings of worthiness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. Number 7, depressed ability to concentrate, feeling very indecisive. And of course, number 8 is the ultimate symptom of someone struggling with depression, and that's thoughts of death, recurring suicidal ideation, which means just having kind of passive thoughts of how you would end your life, and of course, a suicide attempt. So, a lot of you might be saying, well, that's, except for maybe number 8, that's kind of how I feel on a daily basis. And so, again, I just want to go to the next slide just to hone this in on what are the symptoms. The emotional part of it is sadness, low self-esteem, mood swings. Like I said, gentlemen normally manifest depression by anger and irritability. And ladies, we are more of the emotional side of, and mood swings, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. But the cognitive aspect of depression has to do a lot with internal talk, a lot of self-criticism or self-loathing, confusion, difficulty concentrating, and of course, the thought of suicide. Behavior. That's when someone's having a difficult time crying. I mean, they're crying a bit, they're withdrawing, just not even taking care of their responsibilities. A sense of restlessness at all times, just not really sure what's going on, that you're feeling not at ease. Excuse me, I need to get to another slide. And here's the part physical. So this is a difficulty with us with the bleeding disorder. Chronic fatigue, sleeping too much or too little, that's not so much what I was referring to, but these ideas of unexplained aches and pains, that's a symptom that's difficult to distinguish between is there a bleeding disorder or is there something else going on. As I go around the country, and I've had an amazing opportunity to go in many chapters last year, invariably I get asked the same question. Deb, how can you tell whether it's a loved one or someone at work when they're just kind of situationally and temporarily kind of having trouble with mental health issues, struggling with their feelings versus a bona fide mental illness? I've figured out a lot of different ways to talk about this, but I think that the most effective way of talking about this is through disclosing and sharing my own experience with mental illness. It's a very interesting position to be in, to be a licensed professional counselor and also being treated for depression. But as you know, it's far more likely than not. But the way you describe someone having, well, I guess I'll go more into it. It was 8 years ago when I was diagnosed as having major depressive disorder, and it was triggered by reoccurring PTSD. And the way that I was now can explain to people the difference between just being sad temporarily or maybe intensely is that it affected all aspects of my life. I wasn't able to work. The thought of doing a webinar like this would be so far from my range of skills at that time. Basically, just wasn't able to function. I just didn't care about things that I normally cared about. I was consumed with my own thoughts of doom and self-criticism and feeling very hopeless that things were going to get better. Relationships, people made me nervous. People agitated me, and I was afraid people would trigger my anger and depression, so I would withdraw from them. Severity of symptoms, that's where you really understand whether you're struggling temporarily or you're in something that's bigger than yourself. And that is when it's pervasive pervasive throughout your day and pervasive in terms of just trying to live your life in general. The opposite of depression is not happiness. The opposite of depression is apathy. Um, I'm sorry, I didn't say that right. The opposite of when you're feeling depressed, you're apathetic. It's not that you're not happy. It's just that you really don't have a sense of your life. Really don't care one way or the other. You're not in your life. But for me, how I really figured out I was more than sad was because I felt as if I had no control whatsoever of my emotions and thoughts and behaviors. It was as if at times I would become triggered and a light switch would go on in my mind, and I really couldn't will myself out of this. And of course, as I found out later, it's because my serotonin dipped to a level where I wasn't able to function. I say this, I spend time on this when I'm giving webinars or giving presentations, not to hone in on me, but to let you know that number one, mental illness is real. It affects high functioning people and it's treatable. If it wasn't for the makers of Celexa and Adderall, I might not have been able to give this presentation. So that's the reason I go ahead and disclose what I'm going through and continue to go through. It also helps me with this next slide. How do you help someone who's psychologically struggling? Well, I could have intellectually told you this as a psychotherapist, but now I can tell you from another point of view, reaching out to that person that's struggling many, many times. Many times, I say it that way because sometimes people aren't even aware they're in depressive funk or anxious or having a problem with substances. So it's like catching them in those times when they're willing to talk about it. Listening non-judgmental, I think this is one of the hardest things you can do when your loved one is in a depressive cycle or they're actively drinking themselves to death or having struggling with alcoholism, is to be neutral and non-judgmental. But what happens is very well-intended people say things like, if you choose to end your life, what would happen to your family or what have you, and it just adds a lot of shame. Or what happens is people say, oh, you shouldn't be so depressed. I mean, you have a wonderful job and your kids, and factor comes to your door. And those are very well-intended statements to help cheer someone up or give them perspective. But what it does to the person who's depressed, it adds shame that there's something wrong with them because they shouldn't be feeling these ways. One of the most helpful things you can do with someone struggling with any of these conditions is to validate their emotions and thoughts. To be that person to say, you know what, I can't feel what you're feeling, but I can see it's real for you, and I'll just sit here with you and listen to what you have to say. This next statement is very tricky. Giving information, reassuring someone, but not giving advice. Yes, we all want to say, you know what, you need to go see someone. And that could also be very appropriate to say in some occasions, but it can also be very threatening. And to hear someone say something to the effect of, I've heard that a lot of us are struggling with depression these days and stress because of the current life situation. And I've heard about that therapy can help. I've heard about it. You actually go to the bookstore and find these worksheets. They can be kind of helpful. I myself, I like to go to a quiet space and do some meditation. Many times that helps. And the difference between reassurance and advice, with advice, you're usually saying something to the effect that you should be doing this. And it's just a very helpful way of talking. Providing practical help, many times when someone's in a very dark spot, they don't really need a lot of things. They might need for you to go pick up the dry cleaning or watch their kids so they can take a nap. Just something practical. It helps people feel cared for too. Encourage self-help. This seems like a no-brainer, right? But many times when we're struggling with someone who's having a problem with any of the mental health conditions, that we always tell them to go somewhere else to get some help. And many times there's so many things we can do ourselves, like exercising, like meditating, like eating properly, not having too much caffeine. So, and the other part of that is having that conversation with a person. What has helped you in the past? And number one, it treats the person with the dignity that's having problems with their feelings. And number two, it includes them in the process of what could help them. And of course, encourage professional help. But this doesn't always mean going to see a shrink or going to see a therapist. Many times it does, but that's not always the case. Going to see a general practitioner and having a full workup of your body to see if your numbers are in check or in balance, that could be very helpful. Ladies, especially for us, going to a gynecologist to see the whole picture and how different periods of our life can be the reason fluctuating for our feelings and thoughts. Professional help can also be someone that you trust in the spiritual realm of the world. So I just wanted to lay that out there, that it doesn't always mean to go see a psychiatrist or a therapist. And don't give up. A couple of things. Maybe you're not the person to have an effective conversation with someone you love struggling with mental health. Finding that other person or engaging them who has helped you in the past is super helpful. Don't give up is the same thing that we did when we were diagnosed with our bleeding disorder. We didn't stop until we found out what it was and what it takes to get the help we need. Speaking of help we need, one of the things I decided that once I went on the road and had my personal campaign to increase awareness of mental health issues in our community, I knew I would be doing a lot of injustice if I left it just there. And so I came up with a resource guide. It's actually called the Mental Health Resource Guide for the Bleeding Disorder Community. That you can see the whole document on my website, Mental Health Matters 2. And on there, what I decided to do is list the various ways we can get help. The resources that you're seeing in front of you, many of these are books, and some of these are actual workbooks. For the gentlemen, I seem to be enjoying this one, How to Stop Feeling So Damn Depressed. I think that it's a no-nonsense guide. It really is practical help, how to deal with depression and anger. And look, we can have our teens, if they ever would, do what we wanted to do. But there's a workbook on relaxation for teens, self-esteem, even social media. Don't feed the monkey mind. That's something that I go around the country actually teaching. The idea is this: whenever we get high stressed, our depression is taking over our bodies. We feel like we need to do something. But every time we do something, we're actually encouraging those feelings to come over and over again. I'm not explaining it very well, but it's if you want to get a book about reducing anxiety and worry, that's the one to get. And of course, the next one is a workbook that you can get on evidence-based stress reduction. Well, I'm 56 years old, and so I didn't realize all of these apps until a very late time in my age, in my development. But there is an app for this. The first one is the one I want to talk about. I'd like to talk about, make sure that we're aware of in our community because it serves two purposes. It's called Not Okay. It costs $2.99 a month, and what it is, it's an app that you put on your phone, and you you write a script, something to the effect of "I'm not feeling great today. I could really use a call," or I'm thinking about hurting myself, or whatever that word could be, or I'm having a significant bleed, and I really could just hear from some encouraging words. Anyway, you make the script, and then you've already pre-programmed 5 people, and all you need to do is push one button, and that script goes out to those 1 people who will hopefully reach back to you. Not only is that important for us emotionally, but also physically because it has a pin drop in the app, so people can find you as well. BetterHelp, for those of you who don't want to go to the trouble or just don't find it appealing to talk to someone in person about things that you hold sacredly inside, BetterHelp is actually an online Skyping service where you can even text with a therapist on a short-term or long-term basis. Headspace. A lot of people know about Headspace, and it's really related to the next one, Calm, which is an app I use every single night to calm all of those thoughts that happen the moment my head hits the pillow. These are wonderful apps to help you get into the moment and to breathe and to just put things into perspective. I'll start with this. I'll talk about this slide, but then I want to go back to the resources. Many times I feel that when I give this presentation, I hope not to give the impression that we're doomed or that because our blood doesn't clot, we are going to have these types of troubles. Because I want to talk about, there's a whole other side of our community that I want to talk about, and that is the things that are so right with us, the things that are available to us, and that is the fact that we're connected. Whether you go to your chapters, whether you're on a Facebook group, go to conferences, we're not only connected to one another, but we're very accepting of one another too. It's like when you say, I have a child with hemophilia, there's this instant acceptance and something in common to bond about. And we have so many resources for reaching out to others to gain support or to become knowledgeable about our bleeding disorder. And we, by nature, seek education. And probably, which is one of the reasons you're on this webinar, are that you go to chapter events. So we have a lot of things that are going in our favor as well. The thing I'd like to end with is, again, to talk about this resource guide. And again, it's on Mental Health Matters 2, TOO, spell it all together, .com. And you'll just want to go to the tab that says resources. What I found was important was to do the obvious, and that is to list all the different hotlines that people can talk to when they need instant support. And I was very pleased to see that it's not only for the general population, they have those specific for teens too, called the JED Foundation. There's a hotline that's specific for the LGBT community to talk about their issues in issues that are unique to their psyche and to deal with all the different issues that life throws at them. Also, for funsies tonight, I won't be getting whatever says it anymore, but you can actually, on the resource guide, it'll show you through Mental Health America, you can take your own online mental health screening. And I'm hoping to see a lot of people do that, because what it does is it doesn't say whether you have bipolar disorder or substance abuse. It just says that you have a lot of symptoms that are indicative that you might be struggling with this. And then you want to go to the resource guide and get help. Support groups. A lot of people, therapy is not their thing, but talking to other like-minded people is. And so there's groups called Depressive Bipolar Support Alliances all over the nation, free groups. There's an organization called the National Alliance of Mental Illness. That's where you're going to find the support groups for, especially for family members who are trying to negotiate the waters of living with someone who has mental illness. And I just updated the resource guide a few weeks ago to make sure you understand all the different things in our community that are there to promote our mental wellness. Things like the HFA's program, Blood Brotherhood and Blood Sisterhood, Coalition B, Gut Monkey with Big Dog, that particularly adventure-based programs can really help people feel connected and to work out a lot of issues of what it's really like to live with a bleeding disorder. One of a lesser-known program that we have in the community, because it just started, and that is called the Wingmen Foundation. Wingmen, E-N, Foundation. What they've set up is something called the Emotional Health Outreach Program, which is nothing less than providing free short-term counseling sessions for people who are affected with hemophilia at this time. I'm not sure if they've opened it up to other bleeding disorders, but I know it is for hemophilia and family members. And then, of course, you have your chapter events. And I just want to give a shout out to Patrick Lynch and everything he's doing with Believe Limited to deal with mental health conditions within our community. He has now committed to having mental health moments as a part of every podcast. And he has these amazing programs called Breaking Through Hemophilia, where he gathers youth in Chicago and New York and talks about hemophilia and bleeding disorders through the theatrical point of view, giving giving outlet of expression and coping through working with the arts. So those were a lot of words. That's the presentation, and that's what I'll be concluding with. But just to say this, that again, having a bleeding disorder doesn't mean you're going to develop a mental disorder. And many times, when life is not going your way, or you have a genetic predisposition, sometimes it is what actually can cause its development. Another way of looking at the mental illness is basically, if you look at it as a seesaw. If you ask me what the definition of mental illness is, and that's when you have your ability to cope on one side of the seesaw and life stressors on the other side. Mental illness really is a result of life stressors just being, with your ability to cope just being a little bit more weight than life stressors, and things get unbalanced. So I appreciate you listening to the presentation. I hope some are part of that was helpful. And I'll be quiet now, so Rich can let me know if anyone's written in with a question or a comment.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. First off, I never want you to be quiet because I can listen to you on and on and on. So, but thank you so much for providing such important information and walking through in such a elegant way as you have done yet again for us this evening. So we do have a couple of questions that have come in for those that joined the webinar. If you have a question, your GoToWebinar control panel at the bottom, there's a question feature. Just type it in there, and I will read those questions out loud. We are going to try to end around 8 o'clock to be respectful of everyone's time, which is about 11 minutes. So again, if you want to ask a question, by all means, type it into the control panel box on your right or left side of your screen in the question panel. So the first question, Debbie, says, while we all have these daily stresses from work and personal life, what advice or suggestions do you have for people that are having trouble seeing the signs that, that your mental health may be getting worse and it becomes the new normal?
Okay, and I assume they mean that the person themselves, how can they see the signs? Is that the question?
I think it's for themselves and for others. So,
yeah, really going back to definition of mental illness, for me, what really helps, and for what the research is saying, is that we would need to look at impact. What's the impact of the way I'm thinking, or the way I'm behaving, or how is my life being impacted by the way I'm feeling about myself and my world? that's one part of it. You have to look at the impact it's having in your life. And I think the other part of it is how much control do you feel that you have over the impact or over your emotions. And it's a very tricky answer to get to. But if you look at it on how is this functioning in my life and how much control do I have over this, sometimes I can help you get to the answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. Another question that came in says, this is such an important topic. Thank you. How do you envision the role of the bleeding disorder chapters regarding mental illness in their communities? Are you aware of any examples of chapters across the country that are addressing this difficult issue?
Oh, yeah, I can. I'm very excited, and that's a wonderful question because it's a wonderful time. I'm working really closely with NHF, and it is because of the community themselves are requesting this information from chapters that NHF has developed they're in the process of developing 4 new mental health presentations to be taken to chapters across the country. So I'm seeing that there's a huge request for it, and I'm seeing that this request is being filled by our national organizations and also with HFA. The community is asking about it, and they're developing programming. If you look on websites, for example, Steps for Living at NHF, historically they've been looking at ways of getting the information about the correlation with emotional issues and mental health.
Fantastic.
So I'd like to. Yeah, I just wanted to. The program at NHF that's addressing this is called the Education Empowerment Series, and any chapter can request to have this go on in their chapters.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. And that actually dovetails into the other question, another question that we have of what are the national organizations doing to address this issue? So it sounds like this is relatively new with what you've been offering through Mental Health Matters 2, and now what both NHF and HFA are offering. I know that there's some things that maybe you can't talk about just yet, but can you maybe even elaborate a little bit more around anything that chapters could have access to this year with NHF or HFA or with yourself?
Yes, I am. It'll take a moment because I actually have the variety of mental health sessions that are available to be requested now. One of them is mental health basics. One of them is a particular series that I'm actively involved with helping them develop and very excited about, and that is PTSD and chronic conditions. And I think that's I hear that all around the country. We're using that term many times inaccurately, and are sometimes we're not recognizing PTSD. So I'm happy to see that. Another one is what are we not talking about? And that is to talk about the stigma itself and also the cultural differences and how that impacts whether we're going to recognize and or talk about mental health. And I'm sorry, there's a fourth one. I just can't think of it right this moment. But those are the programs that are available. Also, the Hemophilia Alliance, I need to say that the Hemophilia Alliance is in charge of the network of HTCs. Last year, they asked me to come out and train over 60 social workers. Mental health first aid I gave a course called Mental Health First Aid. Basically, it's recognizing signs and symptoms of mental illness, how to have that conversation, and where to turn. So our treatment centers are getting very involved too with this.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much for that update. Uh, this is a question that I have that I would like to ask you, Debbie. As I'm looking at the attendees this evening, we have everyone from volunteers to board members to camp counselors, all the way down to staff members. When you're in a leadership role, especially within the bleeding disorder community, you often help those that trust you and they may come to you. But many of us don't have the training like you do to be a licensed therapist, social worker, counselor, etc. How would you recommend that those in leadership positions in the bleeding disorder community where people trust and they come to kind of balance some of the personal things that are being shared in terms of depression, anxiety, and some other stressors at events like camp or educational meetings? And what are our roles and responsibility as we play with those that may share some personal things with us as we try to respect their privacy, but also want to get them maybe the help that they need?
No, the wonderful question. I mean, the short answer to that is that, like I said, there's a nationally recognized program called Mental Health First Aid, where anyone and everyone, be it from a professional to a layperson, can go and learn the signs and symptoms and how to talk to someone and where to send them to. So that's kind of the short answer to that. And then the bigger question is, how can you be that person? And that is by doing what you're doing tonight. I mean, really becoming informed about what to look for. And you already have the second criteria, which is altruism. You know, you care. You care about how well someone's really doing. So it's really just matching your natural inclination to be that person that cares enough to ask the questions, and then becoming informed of what the signs and symptoms are, and also to normalize. The third thing is just continue to normalize the conversation about this. And then, of course, the fourth part of all of that is to know where to send people, or not send, know the resources, which sources to give to people. So knowledge is power in this case.
Thank you, Debbie. That's a great answer there. I think many of us often find ourselves in those positions and want to make sure that we're doing what's best for those that we care about and also for our community. If there are other questions, feel free to put them into the box. We'll give it another 30 seconds and then we will end right on time so that you can enjoy your evening. So we'll just give it another couple of seconds to see if there's any other questions. While we give that time, Debbie, I think you mentioned this, but I'm going to ask again. If people wanted to get in touch with you, your information's on the screen, your email and cell. Is there what is the we want to be respectful of you as well. Is one method better than the other, or are both okay to kind of reach out to them?
They're both the same, and I work from 8 to 5. I work out of my home, so I have lots of flexibility. But that's not to say that I haven't been receiving phone calls throughout the country in the wee hours of the night too. And so I have to do. So what I'm trying to do is also be professional and help people, and by basically hearing them and then pointing them in the right direction. So I hear what you're saying about them wanting to have that direction, that ready to when somebody calls you.
Absolutely, and thank you for being so open to our community with your email and cell phone. That is absolutely incredible. As we hit the 8 o'clock hour, I think ending on the note of gratitude and thanks for your time, for spending your evening with us, Debbie, and for those that are on the webinar, thank you for spending the hour listening to this important topic. As I'm looking at this quote that's on your screen, Debbie, because mental health is just as important as physical health. I think so often we talk about the gym and we talk about, trying to get our body in shape, but we don't talk about our mind. And I think that's a great reminder to all of us that that's just as important as physical and whatever physical means to each person. So thank you for that reminder, and thank you for this presentation. As a reminder, NEHA hosts educational webinars throughout the year. We try to do them at least quarterly, if not a little bit more. You can find out about them via email, on our website, and on social media. There is an array of events that are coming up. You can find a complete list on www.nehemophilia.org, also www.newenglandhemophilia.org. They go to the same place. Our Consumer Medical Symposium, which is coming up on March 28th, will focus on some of this. We have social workers from hemophilia treatment centers in Connecticut and from other various centers in New England that will help process the change that is happening right now within our community and have a dialogue around some of this, which does affect mental health as well. So with that said, thank you again, Debbie. Thank you for all of you for listening in, and we hope to see you at an upcoming event soon. Have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do, Rich.
Thank you, Debbie.